I am a 26-year-old male, and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for nearly a year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us, and an overlook to the north. We camped in the middle, between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there around 11 a.m. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up into our camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite, and now the firewood that was lying around was his. Now in this particular forest, campsites are first come, first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course, being friendly, we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge dually circling around us. We had an off feeling from this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area we were at was popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a dead sleep when out of the woods I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife, "What the hell was that?" About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent so we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge dually tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in their truck and drive very slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point, we were terrified, thinking they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point, we thought that maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops, and we didn't have signal anyway. We just tried to go back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out of the camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys. We assumed they were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued on into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into the young guys' camp while they were hunting and were robbing them. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the dually guys pulled out guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob the young boys at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't been for the people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was. The people in the white dually never were caught, so people in the white Dodge dually, let's not meet. Despite a few creepy instances as a child, there has only been one time in my adult life that I have truly felt primal fear. I live in a village in the middle of the English countryside. To paint an accurate picture of its size, it has a population of 4,000, but feels more like 1,000, due to its spread out nature and being surrounded on all sides by lots of fields, farms, and woods that eventually connect onto a pretty famous forest. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, and because of this has notoriously bad phone and internet connections. Having lived here all my life, I know the place like the back of my hand. I know where all the public footpaths through the woods and fields are, where they connect, which ones are shortcuts, where to cross deep streams, etc. I've gone on walks in this area throughout my childhood with my parents, and alone as an adult. Nothing bad had ever happened. I felt safe here. This story takes place last summer, in July. After I moved back home from university, I'd yet to get a job, and was smoking a lot of weed. A habit my parents despised, and which I tried to keep hidden from them by going for evening walks. Multiple pre-rolled joints hidden away in my hoodie pocket. As usual this day, they both got home at 5 p.m. We had dinner, but chatted for a while longer than usual, as my mom had had quite a hectic day and was talking to me about it. Because of this, I ended up heading out for my walk an hour later than routine, around 7 p.m. But as it was summer, the sun was still shining, so honestly, I didn't really notice that it would start getting dark while I was out. The woodland closest to my house is less than 5 minutes away, and you enter through a gate in a farmer's field. You can see across the open area quite far until the set of small woods obscures your view. That's where I was heading, as I knew this track takes under 2 hours, and leads back onto the same path I was standing on now. More than enough time to smoke the 3 joints in my pocket, and for the smell to leave my clothing, I had thought. This entire area was very popular for dog walkers, so it's not unusual to see other people while you're out and about, as this is a village where everybody says hello to everybody. I lit my first joint and started walking. I'm just in my own little world for a while until I was less than 100 feet before the entrance to the woods. An elderly man was coming out of them, throwing a ball for his collie dog. I finished my joint and snubbed it out. As I got closer, I recognized it was John, who lived on the road next to mine and knew my grandfather. We stopped and said hello, and I stroked his dog, Max. While talking, I see another man coming out of the woods, with no dog, and wearing a bright green jacket. He was very tall and had a good 10 years on me age-wise. Me and John chat about another minute and say goodbye. He warns me not to stay out here too long as it will start getting dark soon. True, the sky was bright pink and orange. The sun was indeed beginning to set. I hadn't really noticed. I continued on down the path towards the man. When we were nearly passing each other, I look up to make brief eye contact, smile, and say hello, like everyone here does, even if you don't recognize the person. My eyes instantly met his. He was already looking at me, his dark eyes locked on mine. He wasn't smiling. I didn't know him at all, but I knew something was wrong. It was in his eyes. I swallowed my politeness and looked at the ground as we passed. I had lived in my uni city the past couple of years, so I knew a red flag when I saw one, and my country bumpkin manners evaporated. I quickened my pace a little, and before entering the woods, slyly looked back. The guy was still walking in the same direction following John. I felt relieved, laughed, cursed the weed for making me paranoid while lighting up another joint, and started walking into the woods. It takes about 30 minutes to follow the path through the woods to the end. The pathway exit opened into another field that led to another set of woods. The sky was now violet, the dimming light having been obscured to me by the trees. I was already smoking my last joint and was near the entrance to the second set of woods when I felt it. Fear. Complete. Crippling. Absolute fear worked its way like electricity through every layer of flesh. I'd never felt anything like it before or since, but I knew what it was. I whipped around. Standing at the exit of the first set of woods was the man. I could still make out his green jacket in the fading light. He had doubled back, and very quickly too. I had looked back several times while in those trees and he hadn't been there. For a second I froze, as did he. He knew I'd seen him. To sprint the distance between us would take him about 5 minutes. He was obviously in good shape. I threw the spliff and bolted into the woods. The only way I could go. I didn't dare to look behind me. I sprinted for a couple minutes before taking a sharp left turn off the path into the trees, hoping to throw him off a bit, but I couldn't see a goddamn thing. The light was already darkening and the trees made it 100 times worse, especially as I was now in the thick of them. their branches catching on my clothes like fingers, whipping and scratching my bare legs, so bad I bled. I ran and ran, my lungs protesting in pain, hating me for smoking so much, while my heart was throwing itself against my ribcage trying to escape. I couldn't anymore. I threw myself on the ground behind a particularly thick trunk, my back against it, knees to my chest, hand thrown over my mouth to stifle my labored breathing, desperately trying to pump air into my lungs for the next sprint. I listened for the first time. A few seconds pass silently. Then I hear him. Heavy footfall snapping twigs behind me, and about 20 feet to my left. I dare not look in case he sees me. I have my phone, but know I have little chance of signal being where I was, and knew he'd either hear me talking or see the light from the display. I'm not ashamed to say at this point I start to cry, the tears falling silently down my cheeks. "What the hell?" I hear a deep voice exclaim. "Where are you? I know you're here. I saw you." I have to clasp both hands across my mouth to stop my scream from escaping. I can hear him moving around. I panic, and I find enough courage to slowly peek out from behind the tree. He was about 10 feet behind me, less than 20 feet to my left, with his back to me. I moved back, and my eyes searched the area around me. I pick up a pretty heavy rock. I carefully check on him again. His back is still turned, but he's searching through the trees, hunched down lower to the ground now. I make a snap decision with everything I had left. I threw the rock behind me to the right. It clattered through the branches of the trees and made one hell of a noise. I watched him immediately bolt in its direction, laughing. He was freaking laughing. I paused a little, hearing his footsteps get quieter, until I thought I wouldn't be so visible to him if I moved, and threw myself forward. I ran, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but I was also aware that I was getting further and further away from home. I knew there had to be a stream somewhere close. If I found the stream, I could follow it, as it borders the land and ran parallel to some of the footpaths. I ran and ran until the trees finally cleared, and I could just make out another field through them on the other side. I thank God, and push myself a little bit further till I'm out of the trees and the ground disappears from below my feet, and I go head over shoulders down the stream embankment. I crash into the water below. My mouth opens, and lungs fill with muddy water. As I sputter it out, I feel both relieved to have found the stream and terrified he's heard me. My phone is now ruined. I slowly make my way downstream as quiet as possible, listening out for him the whole time as the stream borders the woods, looking up periodically just in case. After a while, maybe half an hour, I notice the trees begin to thin and realize this is the edge of the woods where I would have been exiting and where the pathway connected to the original one I'd started on. If I ran, I could get home in less than 20 minutes. As quiet as I could, I dragged myself on my stomach, back up the embankment army style, wanting to stay as low as possible. I peeked over the top. I could just make out the opening of the wood's exit path about 50 feet away. I sat and scanned the forest line for a couple of minutes, my eyes trying to make out movement despite it now being pitch black. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything either. I pushed myself up and sprinted as fast as I could across the field onto the pathway. I knew the gate I'd entered through was in the adjoining field. It really wasn't far. I was so happy. "You goddamn bitch!" came a screech from across the field. I swear my legs nearly gave out then and there. He had been waiting for me. I turned my head and saw him sprinting out of the woods at full pelt. I screamed and pushed myself further, tears coating my face. All I could do was run. I crossed into the main field now, and I could see the moonlight shining off the metal gate. My house was just 5 minutes away after that. I have never focused on anything as much as that gate. He was faster than me, and getting closer, screaming at me the whole time about how he was going to slit my throat. I ran and ran, pushing myself up and over the gate and ran up the road. I dared to look as I made the turn for my road. He was still following me. I raced up my driveway and threw myself through the door, running into the living room crying and screaming hysterically, pointing behind me towards the door. My dad ran outside while my mom grabbed a hold of me as I collapsed, shaking. As it turns out, my parents had already called the police. As I said, I was going to be out for an hour or so at 7, and it was now past 12 a.m. And I hadn't answered when they had called my now broken phone, which was very unlike me. We called the police again to explain. They came and I gave a full statement. Both my parents and the police were horrified. Nothing like this happens here. There hasn't been a reported rape or murder in the last 100 years. But one look at me and it was obvious I was telling the truth. I was covered in head to toe in cuts and bruises, soaking wet and covered in mud and blood. I won't go into how this experience changed me. It's depressing. But I will say the thing that scares me the most is that they never even had a suspect. Despite him following me so closely, he was gone by the time my dad ran outside. That guy is still out there, and who knows what he is really capable of. This all happened at a secluded lake cabin in deep South Texas, owned by my parents, about 20 years ago. I mean, very secluded. It was maybe 40 minutes to the highway, 40 minutes to the nearest town, and over an hour to the nearest city of any size. The last 4 miles or so were down a washed-out but public dirt road. The road did a tight turnaround directly in front of our cabin, as ours was the last one accessible by it. There was one more cabin past us, but accessed by a private driveway only. On one side of the road was a cliff. The other side was our cabin, then a tract of grass maybe 80 feet wide to the water's edge, and the pier. Next to the pier was a patch of dense woods, maybe 2 acres deep, and then a swampy area going to the next cabin, the one accessed by the private drive. It was kind of scary, as it all created kind of a funneled area to a dead end. We had been there for weeks at a time and not seen another human before. Many of the other cabins were seldom visited, if not completely abandoned. This night we headed into the city to go shopping. We ended up making a night of it, but by the time we got back to the cabin it was 4 a.m. The window of the cabin had these big wooden shutters that flapped down over the windows from the outside. Knowing that everyone would want to sleep in, I went to pull them to keep the early morning sun out. I got back inside, and everyone was ready to go to sleep. Sleeping quarters were all one big room. Altogether there were 6 adults and 2 teens on this night. I finished with the shutters, made sure everyone was ready for bed, and turned off the lights, inside and out. Strangely, less than 5 minutes later, we see headlights coming around the bend of the road. It was very obvious, since it was otherwise so dark. We all thought it was probably just some fishermen coming to launch a boat, as would sometimes happen. The van got to the turnaround, spun around as if to leave the same way they had come, and stopped, when they didn't immediately turn around and leave. I got up to look out the only window on that end of the building. My big, tough, and mostly just nosy firefighter uncle soon joined me while my dad made sure the guns were ready, just in case. We were fully expecting them to start messing with my uncle's truck, or attempt to take something from the bed, but clearly that was not their intent. There was enough moonlight and light from their parking lights, as the headlights were off now, to see an adult man get out of the van with 2 young children. Both boys, we think, but we aren't certain. The driver backed into and down the private drive for the last house, parked, and got out with 2 long poles. My uncle and I have had several discussions as to whether these were sticks or rifles. He handed one to the other guy. The men were both dressed appropriately for the weather. It was cold and they had long pants and jackets. But the kids were in lightweight pajama pants and no shirts. By this time, both kids were audibly crying. The men started leading both children into the woods and down into the swampy area, holding each by an arm. At this point, we were flipping out and trying to decide what to do. Props to my uncle for his quick thinking. He used the panic button to set off his stroke alarm. Suddenly, the van started up. Apparently, there was a third person waiting inside, and frantically they pulled out of the driveway. The men and boys jumped in and the van tore off down the road. We all looked out the window as best we could, which was not very well considering the shutters, and tried to get a description of the van, but only managed a vague and general one. This being a while ago, my mom was the only one with a cell phone, and we knew it only worked way out at the very end of the pier, so my uncle and my dad each took a gun and made the long trek out there to dial 911, frantically pointing the guns at any sound while the rest of our party held down the fort. After fumbling and trying to get a connection, we were finally able to get law enforcement on the line. They never did catch them.